Have you ever asked yourself if you truly belong, or if you've just been trained to fit in? From the moment we open our eyes to this world, we're taught how to walk, how to speak, how to behave. Not for the sake of truth, but for the sake of acceptance. At first, it feels innocent. A child imitates their parents, copies their teachers, repeats what they are told with wide eyes and open ears. They're praised when they conform, gently corrected when they wander too far. And so, like clay pressed into a mold, we begin to shape ourselves around what others expect. Not because it's right, but because it's rewarded. Belonging becomes a kind of invisible currency. You do what you're told, and in return, you're accepted. You don't question too much, and you're welcomed. You agree with the crowd, and you're embraced. The approval feels warm, almost addictive. We become experts at it, blending in, mirroring the thoughts of others, laughing at the right jokes, believing in ideas we've never chosen simply because everyone else believes them. And in this performance, something strange begins to happen. You start to forget where the act ends and where you truly begin. This is how the herd forms, not as a physical group, but as a psychological structure, a system of reward and punishment where comfort is given to those who conform and quiet rejection awaits anyone who dares to stand alone. You're not told to stop thinking. You're just praised every time you agree and ignored when you don't. It's subtle, but effective. By the time we reach adolescence, most of us are already fluent in the unspoken rules of social survival. Don't challenge what's sacred. Don't be the outlier. Don't make people uncomfortable. In high school, in college, in the workplace, the message echoes beneath the surface. If you want to belong, you have to blend in. Even if it means erasing parts of yourself to do it. And so we learn to suppress. We bite our tongues. We laugh at things we don't find funny. We stay silent when something feels wrong. We dress the way we're expected to, speak the way we're supposed to, and carry a version of ourselves that's more digestible to the people around us. It becomes second nature. And little by little, the voice inside grows quieter. Not because it has nothing to say, but because no one ever truly listened. The tragedy is not that we conform. Sometimes conformity is necessary. We all need community. We all need connection. The tragedy is that we mistake conformity for belonging, and we begin to believe that we are only valuable when we are agreeable. But what happens when you start to feel the friction? When your thoughts no longer align with the collective? When your questions disturb the comfort of those around you? You begin to see it for what it is. The so-called belonging you once felt was never unconditional. It was transactional. And the moment you stop mirroring the herd, that acceptance starts to fade. You notice it in the shift of tone, the awkward silence when you express a dissenting view, the subtle distance when you no longer laugh along, the coldness in familiar eyes that once looked at you with warmth. It hurts, not because they've changed, but because now you see it clearly. You weren't accepted. You were tolerated on the condition that you stayed in line. This realization doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in during quiet moments. A late-night conversation that leaves you feeling empty. A meeting where your ideas are dismissed because they challenge the norm. A family gathering where your silence feels safer than your truth. One by one, these moments become a mirror, reflecting back a version of yourself you barely recognize. And that's where the shift begins. Not with rebellion, not with rage, but with a quiet, almost painful awareness. I don't belong here, not because I'm wrong, but because I've stopped pretending. And from that point on, you can't go back. Not really. You can try to play the role again, but it feels hollow. The applause that once comforted you now rings empty. The nods of approval feel more like chains than validation. You realize that belonging, true belonging, has nothing to do with fitting in. It has everything to do with being seen as you are and still being accepted. And that's something the herd can never offer. Because the herd doesn't love people, it loves reflections, echoes, repetition. So you begin the most difficult journey of all, the journey back to yourself. It begins with imitation, not out of weakness, but out of a natural desire to connect. As children, we mirror what we see around us. Gestures, beliefs, emotions. It's how we learn to survive, and more than that, how we learn to belong. But over time, this imitation solidifies into a pattern that goes deeper than behavior. It becomes a structure of thought. And within that structure, a quiet expectation takes hold. Think like us, feel like us, and speak like us, or risk being seen as a threat. This is how the psychological herd operates. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to coerce. It functions through an invisible economy of approval, where every and gesture reinforces what's acceptable and what is not. It rewards agreement and punishes divergence, not with violence, but with something more subtle: exclusion. There is no command to conform because conformity becomes instinctive. Most people don't even realize they've been trained. They believe they're thinking freely, when in reality, their thoughts are the echoes of the collective. And in that illusion of freedom, real thought quietly dies. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was never truly welcomed. You feel it the first time you say something that doesn't align with the group, and the room grows cold. Not angry, just withdrawn. People don't argue, they don't debate. They just stop looking at you the same way. Their smiles become thinner. Their words more cautious. You haven't hurt anyone, but you've disrupted something more sacred than truth: comfort. The herd doesn't want clarity blessing, it wants calm, it wants peace, even if that peace is built on denial. And the moment you bring in friction, by thinking too clearly, seeing too deeply, you disturb the artificial harmony. Suddenly you become difficult, intense, or too serious. You haven't changed, but now your presence demands others to confront things they'd rather avoid. And that is enough to make you feel like an outsider. What makes this system so powerful is that it lives inside you. You don't need anyone to silence you. You do it yourself. Before you speak, you edit. Before you act, you hesitate. You carry an internal filter shaped by years of subtle conditioning, telling you which parts of yourself are acceptable and which are not. And that filter doesn't just protect you, it confines you. The psychological cage isn't made of bars, it's made of beliefs, conditioned reflexes, emotional contracts you never agreed to but still follow. You start to realize that most of your moral compass wasn't chosen. It was inherited, installed, reinforced by repetition, not reflection. The realization comes slowly, and when it does, it changes everything. You begin to see that what passes for virtue in the herd is often just fear dressed as goodness, silence dressed as respect, obedience dressed as moral strength. And once you see it, you can't pretend anymore. You don't break out of the cage with rage. You slip out of it with quiet refusal. You begin to reclaim the parts of yourself you buried to fit in. And that quiet defiance, the refusal to keep living a lie, is where your freedom begins to take shape. Obedience is often mistaken for virtue. It's praised in schools, rewarded in families, and expected in society. From an early age, we're taught that following the rules is a sign of character, of being good, but very few stop to ask, good by whose standards? Obedience becomes a silent agreement, a way to be seen as kind, responsible, mature, and so we follow. Not because we've understood the moral weight of our actions, but because we fear what might happen if we don't. At first, this obedience feels harmless, even comforting. You're not alone in your decisions. There's a structure, a sense of rightness that comes from doing what others expect. It makes life easier, more predictable. But over time, something changes. Obedience stops being a conscious act and becomes reflex. You're no longer choosing to comply, you're programmed to. This is where the danger lies. When obedience becomes institutionalized as virtue, it no longer needs to be enforced. It becomes internalized. People begin to believe that silence in the face of injustice is wisdom, that politeness in the presence of cruelty is maturity, that neutrality in moments of moral crisis is somehow noble, and they're celebrated for it, not because they've done something brave, but because they haven't caused discomfort. This kind of obedience isn't passive, it's paralyzing. It removes the space for genuine thought and authentic emotion. You no longer ask what's right or wrong, you ask what's acceptable. You measure your values against social approval instead of truth. You act not from conviction, but from habit. And slowly your moral compass begins to erode, not because you've lost it, but because you stopped using it. You tell yourself you're being peaceful, but deep down, you know it's something else. It's fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of being the odd one out, fear of losing your place in the group, and so you stay quiet even when your heart is screaming. You smile through moments that make you sick inside. You nod while feeling something twist in your gut, and you justify it all in the name of harmony. But harmony without truth is just suppression. It's the appearance of peace built on the silence of those too afraid to speak. And the longer you live that way, the heavier the silence becomes. It starts to weigh on your chest, your thoughts, your sleep. Until one day you realize you're not at peace. You're numb. There's a kind of comfort that doesn't warm you. It only sedates. It turns you into a shadow of yourself. A person who plays the role well but no longer remembers who they were before the role began. And the worst part is the world keeps applauding. They see your calm and call it wisdom. They see your restraint and call it strength. They don't see the war inside. And for those who begin to wake up, that recognition is deeply painful. You see how much of your life has been lived on autopilot, how many times you traded your voice for approval, how many moments you stood on the edge of truth but stepped back into safety instead. And it hurts, not because you were wrong to seek connection, but because you now see the cost. Real virtue requires awareness. It demands courage. It asks you to choose, not just follow. And that kind of moral clarity is rare, not because people are bad, but because they've been taught that obedience is always right, even when it blinds them, even when it breaks them. To awaken is not to rebel for the sake of rebellion. It is to remember that your conscience was never meant to be outsourced. That silence is not always respect. That comfort is not always peace. And that obedience, when unexamined, can be the most dangerous form of surrender. Guilt, when pure, can be a moral compass, a quiet voice guiding us back to what is right when we stray. But in the hands of society, guilt is rarely pure. It becomes a tool not to help us become better, but to keep us obedient. Most people don't feel guilty because they've done something wrong. They feel guilty because they've thought something different, because they've questioned what was taught, because they dared to consider walking away from the roles they were assigned. It doesn't begin with shame. It begins with hesitation, a subtle discomfort when you challenge tradition, a knot in your chest when your thoughts don't align with the group. You wonder if you are betraying something sacred, your family, your faith, your culture. You haven't harmed anyone, but it feels like you've crossed an invisible line. And that feeling, deep, unspoken, irrational, is guilt. Not born of truth, but of programming. This guilt is not the consequence of moral failure. It's the byproduct of moral conditioning. It doesn't correct, it paralyzes. It makes you doubt yourself before you've even acted. It turns inner clarity into emotional confusion. And when left unexamined, it quietly governs your choices day after day without you ever realizing it. You don't stay silent because you're afraid of being wrong. You stay silent because you feel wrong for simply being different. The tragedy is that this form of guilt is praised. Society calls it conscience. But real conscience is born from reflection, not repetition. Real conscience arises when you confront reality and choose your values with your own hands, your own heart. What most people carry is not conscience. It's inherited emotion, passed down through culture, dogma, and fear. And that's why guilt is such an effective cage. It doesn't just silence your voice, it makes you ashamed of ever having one. It convinces you that your inner rebellion is selfish, that your hunger for truth is arrogance, that your desire to break away is dangerous, not to others, but to your own soul. And so you stay, not because the world has held you back, but because your guilt has made you afraid of yourself. This is why many people never leave the herd, not because they agree, not because they're at peace, but because the weight of guilt is heavier than the promise of freedom. They would rather feel safe in shame than risk the loneliness of authenticity. They would rather apologize for their mind than defend it. But once you begin to see that your guilt was planted, not earned, everything shifts. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "Who taught me this was wrong?" And that simple change in question is the beginning of liberation. Not from society, but from the silent mechanisms inside you that kept you small. To reclaim your life, you don't just need to speak out. You need to strip guilt of its disguise. You need to see it for what it is, a leash passed down in the name of morality. And when you finally drop it, not in anger, but in clarity, you take your first real step toward becoming free. Breaking away from the herd is rarely an act of rage. It doesn't begin with shouting or fists in the air. It begins in silence, in the quiet ache of someone who can no longer pretend. You reach a point where the words spoken around you sound hollow, where the smiles feel rehearsed, where the values you're expected to uphold no longer make sense to your heart. And in that stillness, something fractures. Not the world around you, but the illusion within you. The first rupture is invisible. No one notices it but you. It happens on an ordinary day, in an ordinary moment. A conversation that leaves you emptier than before, a decision that feels like a betrayal of your soul, a truth you can no longer unsee. And suddenly, everything that once felt stable begins to tremble. The roles you played, the ideas you carried, the people who once felt like home, all of it begins to slip through your fingers like dust. You don't feel brave, you feel lost. The herd doesn't warn you that the price of authenticity is abandonment, that when you stop nodding in agreement, people will start looking at you like a stranger. And not just strangers, family, friends, coworkers, people you love. They won't understand. They'll ask what changed. They'll say you've become distant, cold, arrogant. But the truth is, you haven't changed. You've just stopped lying. And that's what hurts the most. Not the anger from others, but the absence. The silence that follows when you no longer fit into the script. You begin to see how fragile belonging truly was, how much of it depended on your ability to conform. And when that conformity dissolves, so does the connection. You walk into rooms and no longer feel seen. You speak and no one really hears. You're surrounded but alone. There's a loneliness that hits when you realize your thoughts no longer echo anyone else's. When the language of the collective no longer fits the shape of your truth. It's not a dramatic exile, it's a slow unraveling, a fading out from conversations, relationships, spaces you once cherished. And though part of you wants to return to rebuild those bridges, you know deep down they were never built on truth, only on performance. This is the threshold most never cross, not because they lack intelligence, but because they can't bear the emotional cost, the fear of being misunderstood, the ache of isolation, the guilt of disappointing others. It's enough to keep most people locked in roles they've outgrown. They choose comfort over clarity, belonging over authenticity. And who could blame them? The path of truth is steep and empty at first. But even in the midst of that emptiness, something stirs. A presence, a quiet strength. You begin to sense that the solitude you're experiencing isn't punishment, it's preparation. That the silence surrounding you is not a void, but a space being cleared. Not for retreat, but for rebirth. The more you walk away from what no longer fits, the closer you move towards something real. You may not know what that is yet. The next place hasn't revealed itself. But what you do know is this: you can no longer stay where you were, not because you hate it, but because it no longer holds the weight of your truth. And leaving, as painful as it is the most honest thing you've ever done. There comes a moment in every awakening where words begin to fail. You've tried to explain your shift to friends, to family, to those who still live comfortably inside the framework you have left behind. You've reached for language, hoping it could bridge the gap between your clarity and their confusion. But no matter how carefully you choose your words, they don't seem to land. They're met with glazed eyes, uncomfortable laughter, or polite nods that say everything except "I understand." And that's when you begin to withdraw, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. This silence is not weakness. It is not the silence of surrender or defeat. It is the silence of someone who has realized that truth doesn't always need to be spoken to be real. That some things once seen can no longer be translated into a vocabulary built for comfort. The deeper you go into your own clarity, the more you understand that speaking is not always the way forward. Sometimes the most powerful act is to say nothing at all. In a world addicted to reaction, silence becomes rebellion. It unsettles people. It disrupts the performance. When someone stops defending themselves, stops justifying their path, stops begging to be understood, it challenges the unspoken rules of the collective. You become harder to categorize, harder to manipulate, because you are no longer playing the same game. And the herd senses this. Your silence doesn't make you invisible. It makes you dangerous. Because it reveals something most people are trying desperately to avoid: the possibility that there is a life beyond approval, a life beyond explanation, a life lived from a place that doesn't require permission or applause. Your refusal to react is not indifference, it is mastery. This silence holds weight. It's dense with unspoken understanding. It says, I no longer owe you a version of me that fits your expectations. It says, I have nothing to prove because I know who I am. And when that kind of silence fills a room, it does more than speak. It exposes. It highlights the noise others make to cover their fear. It draws attention to the emptiness behind loud virtue, to the performance behind public morality. But this silence is not easy to carry. It's forged in pain, in the disappointment of failed conversations, in the grief of disconnection, in the solitude of not being understood. Only those who have tried, who have stretched themselves thin, trying to explain their truth to a world that resists depth, understand the kind of fatigue that leads to this silence. And so, the choice to stop explaining is not an act of arrogance. It is an act of preservation. You stop translating your soul into a language the world was never listening to. You stop burning your energy trying to convince others of your sincerity. And in that stopping, you reclaim something sacred: your inner space. A quiet field where you can breathe again, where your thoughts are no longer shaped by the need to be received, but by the desire to be real. This is the strength of silence. Not emptiness, but fullness. Not withdrawal, but presence. It is the sound of someone who has survived the chaos of conformity and now walks forward, not louder, but deeper. No longer moved by the need to explain, only by the need to remain true. Solitude begins as a void. When you step outside the boundaries of the herd, what greets you is not freedom, but absence. Absence of familiar voices, absence of validation, absence of the scripted comfort you once relied on. And in that silence, something cold and unfamiliar settles in. You're no longer being pulled by the noise of others, but you're also not yet grounded in yourself. The ground beneath you feels uncertain, unstable. This is the in-between where the old self has dissolved, but the new one hasn't yet taken shape. There's a romantic idea of solitude, often painted with the glow of self-discovery and peace. But that comes later. The early stages are raw. You walk through days filled with questions that echo unanswered. You look around for guidance, but no one is walking this path with you. The solitude isn't chosen because it's easy. It's chosen because continuing to lie to yourself is harder. You're no longer willing to wear the mask, but without it you feel exposed. And yet, within this uncomfortable stillness, something begins to stir. For the first time, your thoughts are not being shaped to please. Your words are not filtered for acceptance. Your movements are not choreographed by collective rhythm. You are alone, yes, but you are also unshackled. Slowly, the silence that once felt empty becomes sacred, a space where the fragments of who you were begin to rearrange into something real. You start to notice what you actually think, without interruption, what you truly feel, without pressure, what you value without applause. And you realize how much of your previous identity was a construction stitched together by the expectations of others. You carried opinions you didn't test, followed morals you didn't choose, lived a life that felt good on the outside but hollow within. Now, with the noise gone, you begin to rebuild. Not with grand declarations or instant clarity, but with small, deliberate acts. A choice made from your own center, a boundary set with quiet confidence. A thought pursued all the way through, no matter how uncomfortable it becomes. These moments don't look impressive to the outside world, but inside they are revolutions. This is where true identity begins, not in rebellion, but in reconstruction. You are no longer defining yourself in contrast to others, but in alignment with yourself. And that takes time. It takes patience. It takes the courage to remain when everything inside you begs to go back to what was familiar, to the comfort of being understood, even if that understanding was based on a false self. But as the days pass, the solitude becomes less like exile and more like sanctuary. You stop fearing the absence of others and begin appreciating the presence of yourself. You realize that the opinions you once chased now seem distant, that the approval you once craved now feels irrelevant. And what replaces them isn't ego, it's clarity. A groundedness that doesn't need to shout or prove. This solitude becomes your teacher. It reveals who you are when no one's watching. And from that revelation, something beautiful begins to grow. Not a version of you shaped for others, but a version shaped by truth, by presence, by freedom. Something changes the moment you stop seeking to rebel and start choosing to create. After the dust of separation settles, after the solitude reshapes your inner world, a quiet but profound realization begins to emerge. It's no longer enough to reject the values of the herd, you must now replace them. And that, more than any other step, requires responsibility. At first, it feels disorienting. Without the moral scaffolding provided by society, religion, or tradition, you find yourself standing in a vast open space, free but uncertain. There is no one left to tell you what is right or wrong, no guide to hand you a pre-approved script. And yet, for the first time, you understand that this is not a loss. It's an invitation to build a new foundation, not inherited but chosen, not based on fear or conformity, but grounded in awareness and lived truth. This is the birth of personal ethics, not as a theory, but as a lived practice. It's forged not in comfort, but in tension, in the friction between what you've always believed and what you now feel in your bones. And as you begin to shape this internal code, you do it not to impress, not to control, not to convert, but to live with integrity, quietly, honestly. There is no applause here, no recognition, just a slow alignment between your thoughts, your actions, and your deepest sense of reality. You don't seek to be better than others. You seek to be whole within yourself. You don't speak to be heard. You speak when your silence would be betrayal. You don't act to be admired. You act because not acting would break something sacred inside you. The ethics that emerge from this place are not loud. They don't need slogans. They're not built for performance. They're revealed in how you carry yourself when no one is watching, in how you endure discomfort without abandoning your truth, in how you forgive without forgetting, speak without dominating, love without losing yourself. This new compass doesn't promise ease, it demands presence. But with each step, it gives something back, a sense of inner coherence, the knowledge that you are no longer living according to borrowed convictions, but walking a path shaped by your own clarity. And in that, there is a peace far deeper than approval. There is authenticity, the kind of authenticity that cannot be taken, only lived. To walk alone is not to walk in pride. It is not a declaration of superiority or a rejection of others out of resentment. It is more truthfully an act of survival, an act of loyalty to something within you that could no longer be compromised. After breaking away from the herd, facing the silence, reconstructing your values and awakening to your own presence, you realize something crucial. The world may never fully understand your journey, and you have to make peace with that. The greatest danger at this stage is not doubt, it's bitterness. The temptation to look back in anger, to carry resentment toward those who judged you, left you, or misunderstood your truth. But bitterness is just another form of bondage. It ties you to what you've already left behind. It clouds the very clarity you worked so hard to uncover. To truly walk alone, you must walk in peace. That doesn't mean forgetting what hurt you. It means no longer being defined by it. It means moving forward with eyes open, heart steady, and soul unchained. You stop trying to change those who chose comfort over truth. You stop demanding recognition from those who were never meant to see you. And in doing so, you free them and yourself. You begin to live without theatrics, without explanations, without the craving to be known. Your presence becomes quiet but unshakable. You no longer need to fight to be seen because you've already seen yourself. That is the quiet power of the one who walks alone, not out of rebellion, but because the old path no longer fits their feet. In that solitude, you find something most people spend their lives chasing: inner sovereignty, a state where peace no longer depends on approval, where love is chosen, not needed, and where meaning isn't given, it's created. And though the path is narrow, though it offers no guarantees, it offers something more precious: the chance to live as who you truly are, without apology, without disguise, without fear. In a world that rewards conformity and punishes authenticity, one of the most radical things you can do is think for yourself. This journey isn't glamorous. It's lonely, painful, and often misunderstood. But the cost of staying silent, of living a life shaped by others' expectations, is far greater. Real freedom begins when you stop chasing acceptance and start choosing integrity, even when it isolates you. The lesson is clear. You don't owe the world a version of yourself that fits its narrative. You owe yourself the courage to become who you truly are, even if that means walking alone. Break the reflex to please. Question what you have inherited. And above all, resist the guilt that comes from saying no to roles that were never yours to play. You won't find peace in applause. You'll find it in quiet alignment when your thoughts, values, and actions finally move as one. And from that place, you'll build a life not of rebellion, but of quiet strength. A life rooted not in the need to be seen, but in the power of being real.